The Francis Hutcheson Institute started about 12 years ago, and it was actually originally called Northern Light Review. The idea was to try and improve some of the intellectual quality of public debate in the province of Northern Ireland. Several of us academics were worried about the relative paucity of the intellectual and political arguments here, but also the gap that often existed between good quality academic research and public affairs and political life. So we wanted to try and bridge that gap and at the same time introduce some new, more dynamic and more rigorous thinking about Northern Ireland and all aspects of life here in Northern Ireland.
Well, the whole concept behind the Francis Hutcheson Institute is to look at things differently. And we in the Institute are very conscious that over the last nearly 100 years, last 80 years, that unionism has not had a good press, which is by partially its own fault. I accept that. It's partially circumstantial. But we want to put it right. We want to explain to people that unionism, looking throughout the world, the broad vision, the vision with self-confidence to be the 17th President of the United States, and that sort of stuff, is part of our DNA, and that is totally different from nationalism.
I come from Dublin, from, you might say, the other tribe from Protestant unionism. And I've always been fascinated by how such a small island could contain two sets of people, it seemed to me, who didn't understand each other at all. And about 20 or 30 years ago, I started trying to understand the other tribe. And I do think Ireland is tribal, and I think I come from one tribe, and as soon as I began to understand the other tribe, my own tribe rather cut me off. I'm eternally interested in this clash, this challenge, because I love both tribes.
Well, I'm going to pick up on points I heard this morning, Henry Patterson and Graham Walker, both addressing this issue about the relationship between violence, sectarianism and the broad campaign of unionism at the beginning of the century against Home Rule and against Irish nationalism. I mean, those are the really difficult issues, and they're not the most pleasant issues, but I think one of the things about Francis Hutcheson, and we are after all the Francis Hutcheson Institute, was, apart from being a very liberal and humane thinker, he took on the most difficult issues. So I'm going to try and address those issues, try and say things which I hope to some degree are new about our audience. I will be talking, of course, about the industrial strength of Belfast. I will be talking about the attempts to cast, as Graham Walker has already made this point, the opposition to Home Rule in modern democratic terms, which undoubtedly is the case. There's a very conscious effort to say that if you're a good Democrat, then you should support the unionist cause, and it's accepted by a lot of people outside Northern Ireland. But also look at the aspects of the case which don't quite fit with that, and the darker side.
Yeah, well, I was very pleased to get the invite to speak here about unionism, case against Home Rule, and the whole question of modernity, because I think it's quite often unionism is seen, particularly outside Northern Ireland, solely in terms of sectarianism and resistance to change. So my focus was on working class Protestants who were unionists, at least with a small u, some with a big U, and the degree to which they were organised separately from the main unionist thing in labour politics from the 1880s through until the Covenant and Home Rule. And I think the main point I wanted to make was that you have key unionists who are also working class, like William Walker, who was the leading Labour figure in Belfast in the Home Rule period, and their basic argument was that the union, the existing framework, was the best possible framework for working class people because there was lots of progressive legislation being introduced in the rest of the United Kingdom.
My grandfather was Paddy Devlin, founder member of the SDLP and also Northern Ireland Labour Party and a trade unionist of some renown.
So, what about your own particular politics?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't declare sort of explicitly, but I'd have some of Paddy's Labour, I suppose a British as well as an Irish Labour support, I think, and you know, not. I don't think it's worth me saying in terms of my Northern Irish politics, as it were, except to say that I try and look at it on a British sort of basis.
And where are you living at the moment?
Well, I'm based up at Stranmillis, actually not too far from where I work at Queen's University, Belfast.
Great. So what do you think of this event?
I think it seems to have gone very well. Seems to have been. I was talking back there about some of the overlap, and some papers seem to complement each other. Some of the speakers seem to have. It seems to have worked very nicely in terms of each one flowing into the other. There seem to be, a lot of different bases covered in terms of the labour aspect, in terms of science, just there, in terms of. I think this part of unionism and this part of Northern Protestantism, which is often missing from coverage both in the media and in terms of academia, which has been weaker traditionally anyway, which is why this conference, I think it was very worthy this conference happened today.
I think it's a very good event. I think the papers have been very good spread in terms of what we're hearing. A lot of ideas coming forward, and I think it's very important to, sometimes you can, I think, go through life without focusing on some of the concepts, and so it's possible just to focus on the events but not to look beyond the events. And I think the good thing about the conference is that we're actually getting the concepts as well as the events and the realities of the period, and that's very important, I think, to put into context what actually happened and why it happened.
I think the event so far has been a very informative session, particularly for myself, hearing snapshots of what this period of history is all about, and it's good to hear again the concepts and a wee bit more depth into the broader idea of how people can be influenced and informed. So yes, it's a very good event, and the likes of this should be rolled out more, that more people can be educated and informed as to the background to their own personal identity and of course their cultural and political identity in society.
My argument in my paper is essentially that the idea of the nation and the rise of what have come to be called nation states, I think the idea of the nation state is very problematic, is not necessarily, or should not necessarily be conflated with the idea of modernism. I'm trying to argue as well that there's been a problem with how Ulster Unionism has been seen because of the influence since the 1960s in particular of ideas of civic nationalism promoted by people like the German theorist Jürgen Habermas. And against that, and against the teleological way in which Irish nationalism in the south is understood, Ulster Unionism is seen as being backward-looking, defensive and anti-modern. One of the points of this conference is to recapture that isn't necessarily where it came from or how it should be understood.
This event is a very useful exercise. So far, it's been very thought-provoking, and those of us who have been always looked upon as being to the right in unionism have got a lot to think about based on what we've had and we've heard here, where liberal unionism was taking us. And perhaps the liberal unionism of that day was slightly different from the liberal unionism of today. That is anathema to most unions because they have seen it as something that was selling out their position. But this was certainly not the case. This was something that was all embracing.
Well, I suppose I'm representing the Francis Hutcheson Memorial Committee, which is a committee that's based in Dublin but has members in Belfast and all that. And we came together a couple of years ago because of the fact that Francis Hutcheson, who died in Dublin incidentally, he was born in Saintfield in County Down, but he died in Dublin in 1746. In fact, in his time, although he worked in Glasgow University for a long time, he was known as Francis Hutcheson of Dublin. So we're quite proud of him in Dublin.
I think it's an accent day here down at the Ramada. The quality of speakers has been great. The topics, I feel, have been very relevant in the sense of looking at 1912-14 and the whole Covenant period, but perhaps looking at it from a slightly different angle with regard to the churches, with regard to science. And I think it's been informative and helps us look at today through the lens of the past.